The howling wind cut through the Montana territory like a knife, whipping snow into blinding sheets across the rugged landscape. Inside her isolated cabin, Elizabeth Winter stoked the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across weathered log walls. At 32, she'd learned to find comfort in solitude after 3 long years as a widow. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried beneath the snow? Elizabeth's voice carries over the crackling fire. I once believed I knew everything about my life, about love, about loss. I was wrong. The year was 1878, and Elizabeth had built a life of quiet resilience since her husband Thomas was gunned down returning from a supply run. The authorities searched briefly before abandoning the case, leaving her alone with unanswered questions and a grief that settled into her bones like the winter cold. If you've ever lost someone suddenly, you know how the world stops making sense. How do you continue when everything you believed about your life shatters in an instant? Stay with me, and I'll tell you how I found my answer in the most unexpected place. Like this video if you've ever had to rebuild your life after loss. Subscribe to hear more true tales from the Wild West that challenge everything you thought you knew about justice and mercy. The blizzard had raged for 3 days when Elizabeth heard it, a faint knocking barely audible above the howling wind. Rifle in hand, she cracked open the door, expecting nothing more than a branch torn loose by the storm. Instead, she found a man face down in the snow, blood pooling beneath him. His hat had blown away, revealing dark hair crusted with ice. One hand was outstretched toward her door in a final, desperate plea for help. Elizabeth hesitated. 3 years alone had taught her caution. The frontier showed no mercy to the trusting. Yet something about the stranger's vulnerability stirred something long dormant within her, compassion, perhaps, or simply human connection. God help me, she muttered, setting aside her rifle and bracing against the wind. With strength born from years of frontier living, she dragged the unconscious man across the threshold, leaving a crimson trail in the snow. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing them together in the warmth of the cabin, a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Blood soaked through the stranger's coat, a gunshot wound to his side. Elizabeth worked methodically, cutting away frozen clothing with shears that gleamed in the firelight. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but infection and blood loss threatened to claim him nonetheless. Names. James, he mumbled before consciousness slipped away again. Elizabeth cleaned the wound with whiskey, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. She'd learned basic medicine from necessity. Out here, you either became your own doctor or you died. She threaded a needle and stitched the ragged flesh with neat, even sutures. For 3 days, James drifted between consciousness and delirium. Elizabeth spooned broth between his cracked lips, changed his bandages, and placed cool cloths on his fevered brow. She spoke to him sometimes, her voice filling the cabin that had known only silence for too long. You're safe now, she told him, though she wasn't certain he could hear. The storm won't take you. Not while I'm here. On the 4th day, his fever broke. James opened eyes the color of a winter sky and truly saw her for the first time. Why did you save me? James asked, his voice rough from disuse. He sat propped against pillows, strong enough now to feed himself the venison stew Elizabeth had prepared. Elizabeth paused by the window, watching ice crystals form intricate patterns on the glass. Out here, we help those in need. There's no guarantee anyone would do the same for us. James studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Most would have left me to the wolves. I'm not most people, Elizabeth replied simply. The blizzard showed no signs of relenting, trapping them together in the small cabin. As days passed, James regained strength. He began to help with small tasks, whittling kindling, mending a chair with a wobbly leg, telling stories of his travels across the frontier that made the evenings pass more quickly. Elizabeth found herself laughing for the first time in years. The sound startled her, like discovering a forgotten treasure in a dusty corner. You have a beautiful laugh, James observed. You should use it more often. Elizabeth's smile faded. There hasn't been much cause for laughter these past years. That's your husband? James asked one evening, nodding toward the photograph on the mantel. Elizabeth followed his gaze to Thomas's image, handsome, confident, with eyes that had once looked at her with such tenderness. Yes. Thomas. He was killed 3 years ago. I'm sorry, James said, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. They never found who did it, Elizabeth continued, the familiar ache of loss rising in her chest. He was coming back from town when someone shot him. Took his wedding ring and left him for dead. James stared into the fire, shadows playing across his face. The frontier breeds violence. Good men die while others prosper. He was the best man I've ever known, Elizabeth said firmly. Gentle. Kind. He didn't deserve what happened to him. James nodded silently, his eyes never leaving the flames. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they weren't who they claimed to be? Comment below with your experiences of trust and betrayal. The morning dawned clear, the storm finally breaking after weeks of relentless fury. Elizabeth moved quietly, not wanting to wake James, who still slept near the fire. His clothes, stiff with dried blood and grime, needed washing before he could travel again. As she emptied his coat pockets, her fingers found a folded paper and a small leather pouch. Curiosity overcame propriety. She opened the paper to find a wanted poster, the crude drawing unmistakably Thomas. The name beneath read, Thomas Winters, with a substantial bounty for his capture or proof of death. Her hands trembled as she opened the pouch. Inside lay a gold wedding band, Thomas's ring, which had been missing when his body was found. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her as understanding crashed down upon her. James wasn't just any bounty hunter. He was the man who had killed her husband. Elizabeth's breath came in short gasps as pieces fell into terrible alignment. The way James studied Thomas's photograph. His reluctance to speak of his work. The gunshot wound that brought him to her door. She reached for her rifle, her movements mechanical, driven by a cold rage that burned through her veins. You killed him. Elizabeth's voice cut through the morning quiet, waking James instantly. He saw the wanted poster in one hand, Thomas's ring in the other, and the rifle aimed at his chest. He made no move to deny it or defend himself. I didn't know this was his home, James said quietly. I didn't know you were his wife until I saw the photograph. You murdered him and took his ring as proof, Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. And I saved your life. I was hired to bring him in, James replied, his eyes meeting hers steadily. He drew on me. I had no choice. There's always a choice, Elizabeth said, the rifle unwavering despite her trembling hands. James nodded slowly. You have every right, he said. But before you pull that trigger, you should know the truth about your husband. Thomas Winters wasn't his real name, James said, his voice gentle but unflinching. Before he came here, he was William Tanner, wanted for robbing a bank in Colorado. 2 people died in that robbery. Elizabeth shook her head in denial. You're lying to save yourself. I wish I were, James replied. I tracked him for months. When I finally caught up to him, he begged me not to take him in. Said he had a wife who knew nothing of his past. Stop, Elizabeth whispered, but James continued. I told him to come quietly. He pulled his gun instead. I didn't want to kill him, Elizabeth. I was just doing my job. The rifle lowered slightly as doubt crept in. Thomas had appeared in her life suddenly 5 years ago, with few stories of his past. He'd been eager to settle in this remote location, far from towns and lawmen. Why didn't you tell me when you realized who I was? She demanded. At first, I was too weak, James admitted. Then. I couldn't bear to destroy what was left of your happiness. Elizabeth's world collapsed inward, everything she believed about her life with Thomas, or William, cast into doubt. Had any of it been real? Had he truly loved her, or had she merely been part of his disguise? The rifle lowered to her side as anger gave way to confusion and grief. "Get out," she whispered. "Take your bounty and go." James gathered his few belongings silently. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth, I believe he loved you. A man doesn't fight that hard to protect a lie." After he left, Elizabeth sat alone in her cabin, surrounded by memories that now felt tainted. The photograph of Thomas stared back at her, the face of a stranger who had shared her bed and her dreams. She thought of the man who had killed him, the man whose life she had saved, whose wounds she had tended, whose company had briefly lifted the weight of her loneliness. If you're enjoying this story of truth and deception in the Wild West, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales that explore the complex nature of justice and redemption. Days passed in a fog of confusion. Elizabeth moved through her chores mechanically, her mind replaying every moment with Thomas, searching for signs she might have missed. Had there been clues in his reluctance to visit town? In his wariness around strangers? In the nightmares that sometimes woke him, sweating and calling out names she didn't recognize? She removed his photograph from the mantel, unable to bear his gaze. Yet she couldn't bring herself to destroy it either. Instead, she placed it in a drawer, alongside the wedding ring James had left behind. At night, she lay awake wondering which betrayal cut deeper, Thomas's lies or James's truth. Both men had entered her life and upended everything she thought she knew. Both had left her questioning her own judgment. "Who were you really?" she whispered to the darkness, unsure which man she was addressing. Spring approached, melting the snow and revealing the land beneath. Elizabeth threw herself into preparing her garden, channeling her confusion and grief into physical labor. The earth didn't lie. It responded to care and attention with honest growth. She had survived loss before. She would survive this too. The soil yielded to Elizabeth's hands, dark and rich with promise. She planted seeds with methodical precision, carrots, potatoes, beans, crops that would sustain her through another winter. Sweat beaded on her brow despite the cool spring air, her muscles aching from exertion. Physical pain was a welcome distraction from the thoughts that plagued her. With each thrust of the spade, she buried another question about Thomas, about James, about her own blindness. "You can't change the past," she told herself aloud. "You can only decide what to do with the truth you have now." And what was that truth? That she had loved a man who wasn't real. That she had nursed her husband's killer back to health. That justice and mercy were more complicated than she had ever imagined. As twilight approached, Elizabeth straightened, pressing her hands against the small of her back. The mountains loomed in the distance, indifferent to human suffering, enduring through all seasons. She would endure too. A movement on the horizon caught her eye, a rider approaching slowly, deliberately. Even at a distance, she recognized the silhouette. James had returned. Elizabeth watched James approach, neither welcoming nor rejecting his presence. He dismounted and stood at a respectful distance, hat in hand, the setting sun casting long shadows between them. "I came to return this," he said, holding out Thomas's wedding band. "It belongs with you, not as proof of a bounty." Elizabeth hesitated before taking it, the gold warm from his pocket. "Did you collect the reward?" "No," James replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "Some truths are better left buried." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Elizabeth studied his face, searching for deception and finding only weariness and regret. "Why come back?" she asked finally. "To make things right, if I can," James answered. "Though I'm not sure what right means anymore." Neither was Elizabeth. The clear lines between victim and villain, justice and vengeance, had blurred beyond recognition. "I can't forgive you," Elizabeth said as they sat across from each other at her table, bowls of stew growing cold between them. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." James nodded. "I understand. I didn't come seeking forgiveness." "Then what do you want?" He considered the question carefully. To know you're all right. To offer help before winter comes again. Elizabeth's laugh held no humor. Help from my husband's killer. Help from someone who knows what it's like to discover everything you believed was built on lies, James countered quietly. The statement struck Elizabeth silent. Of course, James had also been deceived. He'd hunted a criminal only to find a family man. He'd done his duty only to question its righteousness. How do you live with it? She asked suddenly. The killing. James's eyes met hers, unflinching. One day at a time. Some days better than others. If you've ever had to rebuild your trust after betrayal, comment below. How did you find your way forward? The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Elizabeth stood on her porch, watching as James prepared his horse for departure. You could stay, she found herself saying. The north field needs clearing before planting. It's too much for one person. James paused, surprise evident in his expression. Are you sure? Elizabeth wasn't sure of anything anymore. But she knew the work ahead was daunting, and winter would return before she was ready. Just until the field is cleared, she clarified. Then we'll see. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even friendship. But as James nodded in acceptance, Elizabeth recognized it for what it was, a first tentative step toward something neither of them could yet name. That night, James slept in the barn while Elizabeth lay awake in her cabin, wondering if she had lost her mind. Yet beneath the doubt lay something unexpected, a sense of possibility, of life continuing beyond betrayal and loss. Days stretched into weeks as they worked side by side, clearing the north field of rocks and roots. They established careful boundaries, James continuing to sleep in the barn, Elizabeth maintaining her independence in all decisions. They spoke little at first, the rhythm of work filling the silence between them. Gradually, conversation emerged, practical matters of farming and survival, then cautious exchanges about their pasts. Elizabeth learned that James had been a soldier before becoming a bounty hunter, that he had a sister in St. Louis he hadn't seen in years, that he could identify every constellation in the night sky. James discovered Elizabeth's talent for healing plants as well as people, her dream of someday starting a school for frontier children, her ability to recite poetry she had memorized in her youth. Neither mentioned Thomas directly, though his presence hovered between them like a ghost. Yet with each passing day, his hold on them both seemed to loosen slightly. You're good at this, Elizabeth observed one afternoon as James constructed a fence around the newly cleared field. Building things instead of hunting men. Something flickered across his face, regret, perhaps, or hope. Never too late to learn new skills. The incident with the raccoon changed everything. Elizabeth had discovered the creature helping itself to her storage cellar, and her shout brought James running. Their combined efforts to evict the animal resulted in an overturned barrel of flour, a torn shirt, and the raccoon escaping anyway. Standing in the aftermath, covered in flour and defeat, Elizabeth met James's eyes, and began to laugh. He joined her, the sound rusty at first, then gaining strength until they both leaned against the cellar wall, breathless with unexpected mirth. Your face, Elizabeth gasped, pointing at his flour-whitened beard. Yours is no better, he countered, reaching out instinctively to brush flour from her cheek. The touch sobered them both. James withdrew his hand quickly, but something had shifted between them, a recognition that healing was possible, that joy could exist alongside grief, that the future remained unwritten. That evening, Elizabeth invited James to eat inside the cabin rather than taking his meal to the barn. A small gesture, but significant to them both. I've been thinking, she said as they finished their meal. About Thomas, William, whoever he was. James waited, giving her space to continue. I loved a man who didn't exist, Elizabeth said slowly. Yet the kindness he showed me, the life we built together, that was real, wasn't it? Summer faded into autumn, painting the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold. The harvest proved bountiful, Elizabeth's root cellar filled with enough provisions to last the winter. James had stayed, their initial arrangement extending as new projects arose, a leaking roof to repair, firewood to chop, a small addition to the barn. They had settled into a comfortable routine, their initial wariness giving way to mutual respect and cautious friendship. One crisp morning, Elizabeth took Thomas's photograph and wedding ring from the drawer where she had hidden them. James watched from across the room as she placed them in a wooden box, her movements deliberate and calm. "Not forgetting," she explained, meeting his questioning gaze. "Just, making peace." James nodded in understanding. "The past doesn't disappear. We just learn to carry it differently." Elizabeth closed the box and set it on a high shelf. "I've been thinking about your offer to help prepare for winter," she said. "I'd like to accept." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the practical. Winter in the mountains meant months of isolation, of existing in close quarters with no escape from each other's company. "Are you certain?" James asked quietly. Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "No," she admitted. "But I'm willing to find out." If this story has touched you, please like and subscribe. Share in the comments how you found strength after betrayal or loss. The first snow came early that year, delicate flakes drifting from a pewter sky. Elizabeth stood on the porch, watching winter reclaim the land. James joined her, respecting the space between them while sharing the moment. "Last year at this time, I thought my life was over," Elizabeth said softly. "I was just waiting for the rest of me to realize it." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And now?" Elizabeth considered the question, searching her heart for the truth. "Now I know that life continues, even when we think it can't. That the story doesn't end with betrayal or loss." "What does it end with, then?" James asked. Elizabeth turned to him, really seeing him, not as her husband's killer or her unexpected savior, but simply as a man standing beside her at the threshold of winter, of possibility. "I don't think it does end," she replied. "It just changes. Becomes something we couldn't have imagined before." As darkness fell and the snow continued to fall, they remained on the porch, two people bound by a tragic connection who had somehow found their way to something unexpected, not redemption, not romance, but something more profound, the courage to face an uncertain future with open eyes and honest hearts. The Montana winter stretched before them, harsh and beautiful. Whatever path lay ahead, Elizabeth would walk it with the hard-won wisdom that comes from facing the truth, no matter how painful. And perhaps, for the first time in years, she wouldn't walk it alone. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the Wild West's most compelling tales of truth, justice, and the complex nature of forgiveness. If you found value in Elizabeth's story, please subscribe for more historical narratives that challenge our understanding of right and wrong. Leave a comment sharing what this story taught you about resilience and the power of truth.